Another lie propagated by the Remainers, specifically that the UK is utterly dependent on, or was dependent on, its protection of employee rights via its membership to the European Union. This is complete nonsense. Now, yes, I do admit that EU law did imbue some regulations that may or may not have been beneficial to employees. Work time directive is the main one, but there is nothing the EU Parliament could do that our own Parliament can't do. So to say that the British Parliament couldn't or wouldn't legislate its own employment legislation in relation to government policy is a nonsense. Secondly, I've heard a lot of this left wing trope of we had workers' rights until the 1980s and then they all vaporized. This is complete nonsense. At law school, when we did employment law, your average book on employment law is about 2 inches thick. Okay, this may shock the far left, but there is vast and rigorous employee protection in this country. The big one would have been the Employee Rights Act 1996. You've got other new laws, more recent laws such as the maternity leave legislation, and of course the Equalities Act 2010, which didn't really add much. There was legislation in the 70s that said you couldn't discriminate against hiring people in relation to immutable characteristics, but that's beside the point. What I think they're talking about is that the unions lost a fair bit of power in the 80s because their ability to commit economic sabotage, and usually at the best of foreign powers, I might add, was curtailed. So the unions lost a lot of money, but the workers and the unions are different things, aren't they? So, to summarise, we are not dependent on the EU for workers' rights. We have our own workers' rights legislation, and not just workers' rights, but protection of workers in the workplace. This is something that the left doesn't really talk about. But in Victorian time, if you lost a foot in a factory, they just sent you home. There was no real obligation by the employer to make sure that you were safe. That's another major piece of 20th century progress, and that's largely nothing to do with the EU. That's all the tort law, the neighbour principle, that you have an obligation to take care of your staff, especially if you got a contract with them. Anyway, so that's the end of that rant over.